Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So welcome everybody again for the second session on the series of workshops around our GCF program. And of course, even if you are not participating in the GCF call, actually, you are still most welcome to join these workshops in order to benefit from our distinguished panelists and experts who are going to give you an idea about different aspects of writing a good plant application. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Zulfar Bhutta. He is the founding director of Institute of Global Health and Development at Aga Khan University. He is also currently affiliated with University of Toronto. And I think Dr. Zulfar has a very distinguished career. He has recently got a fellowship. I think Dr. Zulfar, I must congratulate on that achievement. Actually, I think you are probably amongst a handful of persons who have achieved this very prestigious position. Actually, Dr. Zulfar has been associated with HEC for the last, I would say, maybe 20 years or so. But recently we have again requested him to chair our panel for the medical and biological sciences. And he was very kind to actually participate as a panel chair actually, and he's also providing us very excellent guidance about all the review processes that we are conducting actually, and also in improving our own processes, as well as today he will be guiding you in order to improve your own applications actually. So without any further introduction for Dr. Zulfar, I'll give the floor to him. Please go ahead, Dr.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zain, and I'm delighted to be able to participate in this. It's awfully early in the morning here in Canada, but always a pleasure to be of utility to the HEC. And I've actually now been affiliated with HEC in research review capacity. I chaired one of the science panels related to medical research back in 2002 for several years, and I'm delighted to be able to help again. So today, what I'm going to do, and I have no idea as to who the participants are and how many are affiliated with health science research or research related to biological and health sciences. But what I've tried to do is to maybe prepare something which will give you an introduction to health research. And then I'll move on to what are the characteristics of a good application. How do you prepare it? And what are the pitfalls that many budding researchers are not aware of? And hopefully this will be of use to people who are starting their clinical career in research or biological research or general research. And so this is largely directed towards the relatively less experienced researchers and not necessarily those who are already well established. I'm very happy to take questions. We will have ample time today because my presentation is only about 20-25 minutes. So I want to start with perhaps just a reflection in our history of health sciences as to how the spirit of inquiry came about. And this was really not always the case. It was actually Claude Bernard, just around 150 years ago, who first introduced experimental medicine. Prior to that, in general, in health sciences or medical sciences at that time, it was largely learning through apprenticeship. Ustad ne keh diya, so kar liya. So I mean, if you shadowed somebody, that's how you learned, and not necessarily through questioning and through experimentation. So Claude Bernard was the first one to principally recognize that physicians were at times very unwilling to concede the important distinction between the power of observation and that of the experiment. And he recognized that gaining experience and relying on observation is very different from actually experimenting and recording observations. So he therefore talked about precise reasoning and born out of the idea of observation and controlled by experimentation. And this power of observation, this power of learning through inquiry, was reflected in a number of things that happened in the last century. And in our own health sciences literature, the contribution of somebody like John Snow and his role in the control of cholera in England, in London, is one of the most important advances that led to the spirit of observational research. So John Snow was actually a closely involved, not because he was a public health scientist, there was no concept of public health science at that time. He was actually an anesthetist. And in 1854, in that major cholera outbreak in London, particularly in the parts of Soho, many people died. And in those days, this was also something that they recognized as a new outbreak of something that was killing people in and around the area of Broad Street in London. Over 100 people died near that area, and the area cleared. People left, and it was therefore recognized that this was a major crisis. By the 10th of September 1854, around 500 people had died, and in some places 1 out of every 10 person had died. And by the end of the outbreak, you had around 600 people who had died. And John Snow got involved because he looked at the data, and in those days there were private companies supplying water to different parts of London, Lambeth, Southwark, and he recognized that lots of these deaths, particularly those that were fatal in relation to population density, were in this area which was supplied by this one particular company. So he then made an observation, and this is a map actually from his time, of where these deaths were in relation to various water supply points. And he had no idea because, the cholera bacterium had not been discovered at that time. So he did not know what we were talking about. People thought this was a disorder related to maybe bad food, maybe air. So when he looked at this map, his power of observation around the distribution of deaths by houses indicated that there was a cluster around Broad Street here, which appeared to be perhaps located to something locally. And that something locally, he thought, was related to the water supply hydrant. So in his own letter at that time, he said he had an interview with the Board of Guardians of this particular parish. And he said, look, we have to do something about the water pump in this area because many people are dying, and I suspect they're getting something from the water. And that's the famous Broad Street pump. And he could not pull the pump out. So what he did was he removed the handle. And this intervention led to an immediate reduction in the number of cholera deaths in that area. This fantastic observational study is now recognized as the Broad Street pump intervention, and it's commemorated, and there's a whole section devoted at the London School of Hygiene, Tropical Medicine to John Snow, who really celebrating the power of observational research, which was established at that time. So one type of health research are observational studies. So I'm going to start with them, and they are of different types. And on the one hand, they are like the case studies that I've just told you about the Broad Street cholera outbreak, descriptive or case series, but they can also be a little bit more formalized. So case control studies where you look back at what your experience is retrospectively and look at what could be factors affecting outcomes from basically looking at the past. So these studies are designed in such a way that if you have cases identified, for example, if you have a COVID-19 case here, and you have people in the same neighborhood who have not contracted COVID-19, and you went to the cases and you tried and identify where could they have potentially got exposure, and what did they eat, drink, who did they meet, what was their contact. And you do the same thing for others who did not contract COVID-19 infection. Now, this looking back and looking at risk factors, retrospective studies, or basically finding out what happened, are retrospective case control studies. So they are one form of formal research where we derive risk factors, relative risks, odds ratios of what had happened, and they're a very important part of the inquiry. You also have a form of observational studies, which are principally cross-sectional studies, which is looking at what is happening right now. And these cross-sectional studies don't look back, but they look concurrently. So again, sticking with the COVID-19 example, if you have subjects who are coming into hospital and they're very ill, and you want to look at the difference between those who are admitted to ICU and those who are not admitted to ICU. And you basically want to see what are the risk factors associated with adverse outcome. Then you can look at this in a short period of time, cross-sectionally, and say out of the 1,000 admissions and the 600 cases who went into ICU, 400 did not go into ICU. This is the difference between them. And that is looking at what is happening right now at this current point in time. And this is not looking backwards or forwards, so this is principally concurrent cross-sectional observation. Then you can have observational studies where you design something which goes prospectively, mustaqbal mein, forward. And these are very strong studies because some of the best studies around in biological or health sciences are these long-term cohort studies where you look at people prospectively in terms of various outcomes that you define in advance, a priori, and you use this to look at natural history of disorders, prognosis, identification of risk factors, and also causes and prevalence incidence of disease. So this would be basically what will happen in the future. So if you have a cohort right now, let's say we were looking at all COVID-19 survivors at this point in time, and you identified controls from those who did not have COVID-19, but were matched to them for age and for gender and for, let's say, even residents, urban and rural. And you now followed them for the next 2 years to look at what happened to these people who had infections versus those who did not have infections in terms of other long-term morbidities or outcomes. So we all know COVID-19 causes significant lung damage. So one of the big interests right now, and that's why people are setting up these prospective studies, is to look at, does it cause permanent damage? Do these people end up with some degree of limitation in their activity and exercise? So these are the prospective cohort studies of the kind where people will look at outcomes either in the medium to short term or even long term. So I'm aware of many cohort studies that have been going on for now 40, 50 years, and they are some of the strongest cohorts that are out there because they look at outcomes at a population level and in relation to human biology. And there is another observational study set which is called historical cohorts. They're not as strong because they are associated with lots of biases, but to understand this, a historical cohort would be where you go back retrospectively. It's like a chart review. And I take a 1,000 patients from the clinical database of, for example, PIMS, and I go and I want to see of all the admissions with typhoid, for example, what can I find from those chart reviews in terms of people who had severe disease or mild disease? What were the factors associated with one or the other outcome? And can I match them against patients who may not have had typhoid and were therefore contemporaneously admitted for other things? This is called a retrospective cohort or retrospective case control study where you could be looking at some of those risk factors. But obviously in this kind of a review or analysis, a lot of the quality and validity of the research depends upon how complete these records are or how complete the information is. And in many instances, the information is not complete. And therefore, they are restricted to some extent by the quality of data available. So these are observational studies. But as I said, Claude Bernard was a very strong proponent of the new form of research, which were experimental studies. And experimental studies are one of the strongest forms or tools of research that we have, where you have either controlled trials or experimental studies which do not have a control, and I will talk about them in a minute. And I'm telling you all of this because many of these things are methodologically important in terms of designing research and proposals, and I'll tell you why I'm saying this, because having reviewed virtually hundreds of proposals recently for the various calls of the Higher Education Commission around medical, biological, health sciences research, there was only one single prospective trial that was submitted. Rest of the stuff were either just cross-sectional studies or studies that were very weak observational studies. So I think having the right design and having the right inquiry is extremely important. So these controlled trials can have parallel or concurrent controls or sequential controls. And I'd like to give you an example. So this is a classic randomized controlled trial where you have a body of subjects and you randomize them to receive an experimental treatment or not treatment. So let's take, again, the COVID example. You have patients coming into hospital and you decide to treat them with plasma exchange versus something which is not plasma exchange, standard treatment, and you want to see over time what happens to survival rates. So if you had a plasma therapy, did you survive better than compared to others who are of the same kinds of patients but did not receive plasma treatment? Now, it's very important that you match these subjects properly and that you're not comparing those who probably have a different prognosis from those who did not receive the treatment. So the random part of this is that this is not by design anything that you are cherry picking or identifying patients on the basis of outcome a priori. So this is very important that these things are done in a very standardized, objective, unbiased manner. So that's what a randomized controlled trial looks like. And if you wanted to be a little bit more complicated, you could have a randomized controlled trial with crossover. That means that they receive a particular form of treatment here. So you could have patients receiving plasma therapy until a given point in time, and then you cross them over and you give them something else. So we could then decide that these patients will receive dexamethasone, but not the same patients as plasma therapy. You will randomly reallocate them. Some will receive dexamethasone, some will not receive dexamethasone. So this becomes a bit more complicated. The only advantage here is that you're testing two hypotheses simultaneously. Does plasmapheresis work? Does plasma therapy work? Or does dexamethasone work? And in some patients, you will be looking at the combination. So some subjects, because they're randomly allocated, will receive both. Will receive plasma therapy as well as dexamethasone. And others will receive either plasma therapy and dexamethasone or nothing. And this is the way these things are designed generally prospectively in terms of randomized controlled trials. One of the strongest designs in randomized controlled trials are what we call cluster randomized trials. And this is something which my group has a lot of experience with, because we've done no less than probably a dozen large cluster randomized trials in Pakistan. Each cluster randomized trial is at a population level because you're randomizing populations and not individuals. And these are generally large, complex, and expensive studies. They take several years to do, and they are generally at population level. So in one example, in this big pneumonia study that we did in rural Sindh, we allocated various union councils to receive the intervention and other union councils as being control areas. Now you can imagine that you're talking about here in Matiari about 1 million people. So you effectively randomized 500,000 people to either therapies, but you did not do so at an individual level. So in these individual clusters, although people had the option of participating in the study or not participating in the study, they did not have the option of receiving an alternative therapy. So generally, these are done when it's difficult to individually randomize studies like this. Now you can have these studies or randomized trials with external controls, including historical controls. They're generally not very strong. So this kind of historical control population without a concurrent control population is a weak design, but they are there. And that means that you're doing a study right now, but you're looking at a different study at a different point in time for outcomes. So we could take again the COVID example and say, I'm doing a study of dexamethasone in terms of its effect on survival in COVID, but I am comparing those results with another study of septic patients where they were given dexamethasone. Now that comparison may not be valid because those patients could be very different, and there could be really quite a number of confounding factors. So to summarize, observational studies have certain advantages. In terms of practicality, these are studies which are easier to do. You could test a large number of hypotheticals in these studies. You could take a large cohort, and you could do this over a reasonably short duration. Generally, observational studies, unless you're doing long-term cohorts, can be done in about a year. And they're not generally very expensive unless you're dealing with a very, very large population size. The only issues with them might be some disadvantages that we'll come to in a minute. In contrast, the experimental studies, the trials that I've just talked to you about, either individually randomized or group randomized, are generally regarded as safer. Why? Because you are exposing relatively few people. In a trial, you only have a few hundred people, whereas here, if you wanted to do an observation of an intervention in hospital, you would have thousands and thousands of people. An example again from the COVID field is hydroxychloroquine. There has been so much interest in hydroxychloroquine and its relationship to outcomes in COVID. And the problem with a lot of that data in the first 3 months of this pandemic has been that a lot of the hydroxychloroquine data was observational. People just came and gave it, and therefore it was indeed confounded by many things. And you may have heard about 1 or 2 such large studies having been withdrawn because they could not convince themselves that they were unbiased. On the other hand, trials of hydroxychloroquine would have been a lot more standardized. They were stopped, and now some of them are restarting. So these are experimental studies are generally safer. They are more vigorous and rigorous. They are precise. You can control them, and they're generally efficient because you don't have to have hundreds of observations. You can focus on a few things that allow you to target your study question. But there are disadvantages to both, and we need to consider those the disadvantages are. With observational studies, there is a well-known disadvantage in terms of specificity. You can't really answer a lot of specific questions because there are lots of confounders, and also systematically, you don't have the same amount of control over the types of subjects that you are focusing on as compared to a randomized controlled trial. On the other hand, randomized controlled trials have always questions about representativeness. They're generally very expensive, and sometimes it's difficult to get people to become controls. So they are more difficult to design, but generally they are considered the gold standard in terms of evidence in the hierarchy of evidence. So I wanted to say a word about hierarchy of evidence for health sciences or medical sciences research. And if you take the hierarchy of where studies are, remember this, and my 20 minutes spent with you would have been worth it. So the weakest evidence is from case reports. किसी ने लिख दिया मेरे patient को मैंने ये किया ये outcome है. That's the weakest type of evidence. That is no different from anecdotal stuff or observational stuff that's biased heavily by your experience. Case series or descriptive studies are just a shade better, but they're also very weak. So you will see in this hierarchy of how the studies become more robust and more evidential. The randomized controlled trials, and particularly multi-center large population-based trials, the cluster randomized trials are considered the very best. And then in synthesizing this evidence, we typically will pool across studies appropriately either by group or by individuals, and these meta-analyses or systematic reviews are considered a very important part of the evidence. So having said all of this, in an ideal world, this is how research is designed, at least in health sciences or medical sciences in particular. How does one go about planning research? So the typical 4 or 5 step process that I tell my students is that if you are planning research, then your first area of importance is the selection of the topic or the area. Why would you want to research in an area would depend upon its relevance, the uncertainty of findings, and their relative importance to health. So we are going to be undertaking a big prioritization exercise for the kind of research that we need in health sciences in Pakistan, inshallah. And here, you want to do research that will impact big questions that are not related to very rare, small, attributable fraction of diseases and populations, but the big questions that we have out there. Things like, for example, why are 50% of the children malnourished in certain provinces of Pakistan? I mean, things at that level. So selection of the topic is extremely important. Then this is one of the weakest areas in the applications that I've seen in the last, several months. You have to have the most thorough analysis of the current evidence around your research question. So you start with one of the most robust literature reviews and discussion with experts as to why you are focusing on this area and has this been done before or not. For example, in high-income countries in the West, and for many research publications in big journals, you today cannot publish a paper without convincing the editors or convincing the peer reviewers that you've undertaken a systematic review on the subject area, or that you have accessed and studied someone else's systematic review of the subject area, so you know what is there and what is not there. And at some stage, if Zan and Athar provide an opportunity, I'd be very happy to talk to you about systematic reviews and evidence, because this is the center that I established in Pakistan about 15 years ago. And that has been one of the big strengths of evidence synthesis from our group, that we've been able to look at a lot of these areas with a very fine lens of evidence collation. So you have to know what the situation is within that area that you've selected, what's been done, what's not been done, and then define the issues. What are the big issues that are relevant in that area, and what is the specific research question? So again, your research question has got to be precise. I want to know if dexamethasone improves survival after COVID infection in malnourished adults between 40 and 50 years of age. That's a precise question. Okay. Or your question could be, does hydroxychloroquine taken preventively once daily for 1 month reduce the risk of acquiring COVID-19 infections in frontline health workers? That's the kind of refined specific question that you would like. Not all health workers, frontline health workers. So it's very important to define your question like this, whether it's for a trial or whether it's for an observational study or anything else. Once you've done this, the next step in research planning is really selecting the right design. And now I can talk more about this because I've given you the various options. Previously, whenever I talked about design, people would say, well, what is a good design? So now that you know what types of options are available, you can design your study to suit the study question, to suit your potential budget, to suit your resources, to suit your laboratory strengths, and also designs which are ethically sound. So of course, we would never, ever put patients and subjects at risk. So studies which do not have the ethical safeguards should never be done. And you have to, therefore, when you're planning to do research, have to have a good understanding of research ethics. So I hope that at some stage in the course of these learning exercises, there will be a greater discussion on what are the ethics of research. For a long time, there was no oversight process in Pakistan. I was the founding chair of the Research Ethics Committee of the Government of Pakistan in between 2003 and 2014. So 11 years we tried to establish this, and alhamdulillah, now there is not only an established process, but many institutions have research ethics committees. So you have to have good, sound ethical question. Then something that I teach my students, I do myself still. Once you've done all of that thinking, sit down with a pen and paper or on your laptop and try and write things down. Don't keep them in your head only. When you write things down, it becomes a lot clearer. Background, justification for what you want to do. What is your hypothesis? What are your questions? And what do you want to end up with objectively at the end of your research? And to do this, what would you measure as outcomes that are important and can be measured? You know, you can say, I want to do this study because I want to measure if people have greater satisfaction with one intervention or another intervention. But if you have no mechanism of measuring satisfaction objectively, then that's not a measurable outcome. So you have to have something which is objectively quantifiable and measurable. Then the next step for you would be to write down your protocol and the design and an analytical plan. Absolutely critical to go through this in a systematic manner. And I know it is time consuming, but research is time consuming. Research is maybe 4 or 5% inspiration. The rest is all perspiration. This is the perspiration part, is spending time and putting things down objectively. Then there are other nuts and bolts of research that you should be aware of, and I'm not going to spend time on this except on the funding and grant application part. You have to have a consent process. You have to have an information process for subjects. You must make sure that there are no conflicts of interest, and you must have the ability to implement it. I must say that many of the research proposals that I and my colleagues have reviewed over the last several months as part of various calls had absolutely no clarity on implementation and scale up. How were they going to get to that final results that everybody wanted in terms of having something available at scale for the populations who matter? And then you go through all of this with the lens of how do you make things happen. So let's now turn in the last 5-10 minutes on what are the tips that I can give you about getting research grants. And here are the 4 important things to recognize for any budding researcher. It is a competitive process, so don't take it as just something that will happen. कोई किसी को gift नहीं करता research monies. You have to compete for them, so therefore you have to be better than others. And to be better than others, your grant application must be of very high standard, and it must be submitted in time. I find again and again that people are just submitting at the last minute, they're just 1 hour before the deadline. That typically tells me that there's not been adequate preparation. Because you typically require a lot of time for just reflecting and reviewing your proposal before you get it in. So deadlines and timelines are a must, and you have to find the right funding agency. So although we are doing this on the HEC platform, but a lot of what I'm going to tell you is generic, and I hope that people will be applying for many other funding bodies, both within Pakistan and internationally, because now there is absolutely no paucity of research funding. You have to look around and see how people are writing grants. And one thing I will tell you, if you write a good grant from Pakistan, particularly for bodies who fund international research, the likelihood of it getting funded is very high. Because in the broad low and middle income countries, competition is not as intense as within high income countries. So there are lots of bodies which give research monies only to institutions in low income countries. Even within COVID, there are some grant opportunities which are only available to those institutions or people who are in the low and middle income country category. So finding the right funding agency, absolutely important. Then the right funder, you have to identify within funders who are the people who best match your interests? There is no point in going to a funding body if it does not support trials. There are many agencies that will not support research trials. So don't waste your time with those. So find out what are the areas that people will fund. So getting information on the funding body that you're going to target is absolutely important. And I find that many people don't do the right amount of due diligence and research, whether or not that funding body will be able to fund your work. And there are some people who will fund individuals, and there are some people who will fund institutions. So you have to have that information. So researching and finding the right funder is absolutely important. So, and there is information now available on the web. Find out who have they funded in the past. Have they funded anybody in Pakistan? Have they funded anybody in the region in South Asia? And if they're funded, what are their areas of interest, specific areas of interest? Most funding bodies, the Wellcome Trusts, the MRCs, IDRCs, will very clearly put out, this is what we fund. These are the areas where we have funded. And if you're not very clear from their description, just see the titles of the grants that they have funded. They will all have that on their website. What kind of research have they funded? They will have summaries, abstracts, and you will find out if they do fund individuals or if they fund organizations. And this is very important for many bodies, because I know that for just the right amount of audit and due diligence, many people will not fund individuals, but they'll fund universities, they'll fund departments, they will fund organizations, and you can come to those grants through the organizations, but you have to have the strength and weight of the organization behind you. That's one of the reasons why we want to strengthen research in universities and have the infrastructure. So then an application goes from XYZ university in, for example, one of the provinces, then people know that that university has a due diligence and process of oversight, administration, audits, financial management, and safeguards for research that are very important. And then you want to know what types of grants do they have, short-term grants, long-term grants, and what is the usual value. If you've gone through this and done this due diligence, you would have a very clear idea if the type of research that you want to do fits what this particular funder would like to do. So what do you do once you've found the funder? So if you find a funding body whose interests closely match yours, then you either begin, I wouldn't say writing your proposal, but you begin adjusting your proposal to suit the template or the format of that particular agency. And it's extremely important to at least have some stuff ready, because many agencies will require you to send in a letter of interest, a short summary of what you want to do before they encourage you to submit a full application. So those instructions and formats by the agencies are very important. Now, if you don't have clarity on what they're saying on their web, many times you can write an email, you can send the questions in, and for most requests for applications, RFAs, there is actually a grace period of 15-20 days in which they will accept questions and provide you those clarities that you need. And remember that you can develop your research proposal that you can send to multiple agencies. You can send to research funding bodies in country X, country Y, send in the US, Canada, United Kingdom, Europe, European Union. And the common reality is that more often than not, you will be rejected. But that's quite all right. It's like your papers. When you submit papers to journals, you must be mentally prepared that you would have several rejections before a good journal accepts your paper. So failure is very much part of research. And I tell my students again very frequently that in health sciences research, there is something that we call the iceberg illusion. That for successful groups and people, what people see are successes, papers that you publish, grants that you receive, accolades that you are given in the media or through national bodies. And what they don't see is that behind the tip of the iceberg is actually a lot of sweat and disappointment and failure and time, which is hard work, which is what you need to spend in terms of getting to that pinnacle of success. So remember, failure is very much part of research. And in the famous words of Thomas Edison, who actually failed almost 10,000 times before he discovered what was the winning combination in the light bulb that he made, he said, I've not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that things won't work. And that is very much part of research also. So I, again, would encourage young students not to be too disappointed if you have failures in getting your research grants funded. That's very much part of the game or part of the process. But every failure should make you better, should give you a sense of where you need to go to be more successful. So what are the success and failure indicators for proposal? And I'll just have a couple of few slides just to show you this. And this is very much a personal listing. I think the success indicators of a good proposal are where there's a very clearly defined research question, where there is a good literature review or background as to why you are focusing on this question. And the more relevant it is to Pakistan, the better it is. So I've seen proposals that are totally based on things that have been done outside in maybe high income countries and don't have a relevance to what the reality of the burden of disease or ill health is in Pakistan. So whatever you can provide as a solid reference to the literature and background is important. Your objectives must be very clearly specified. And you must have a conceptual framework as to why you think your research is going to answer that question. You have to have the right design. If you think something is important to evaluate through a randomized trial, for heaven's sake, don't send a proposal which is an observational study or a case control study. And then, of course, what I also tell people, do not submit a proposal without at least some pilot or initial information or data that tells people that you are in the right direction, that you are interested in a subject area. So if I want to do a project on vaccine development and I've never done any purification work in my life, don't even know what an antigen is or how to purify an antigen and to attenuate it, then clearly people will not take you seriously. So you have to have some inkling in your proposal that tells people that you're serious, that you're logical, and that you are interested in this space because you're already working in that area. So your work in that area doesn't have to be hundreds of studies before. It could just be that you've understood the question and that you looked at a few pilot things to see if they would work. And if you have a lab, that you've done a few experiments where you think something like that would be feasible. So having the availability of resources, the laboratory, the networks, the data science backbone is extremely important to convince people that you have a good proposal. So this checklist of kind is something that helps me even today. Although I've been in research for almost 40 years now, even today when I write or help lead a proposal, I want to make sure that I go through all of these elements in a proposal to ensure myself that we are submitting a good grant. So what are the counterfactuals? What are the failure factors that I see in grant applications? Poor language is one of the biggest red flags. Bad English, bad grammar, bad structures tells me that the person has not spent enough careful time on reviewing what he or she has written. And this is extremely important. It puts off people. So typing mistakes, spelling mistakes, syntax mistakes, these reflect lack of seriousness on the part of the grant applicant. And therefore spend time on this. If you have not undertaken a literature review, and if you've not integrated that into your proposal, I'm not convinced that you know what you're talking about. So you have to have those foundations in your proposal that tell me that you have the conceptual framework and you want to work in that space because you know the problem. unrealistic budgets that are grossly inflated, or at times too low for the work that you need to do, and they're not linked to the methodology. I mean, these are big red flags for failure. Lots of reviewers don't look at the budget. I always look at the budget, because to me, it tells me very clearly if the person has spent enough time on a proposal. We recently reviewed a proposal where the budget was completely unrealistic because for the work itself, there was not enough money. The money was there on salaries, but not for the actual experimentation. Look and spend time on your methods. If the methods are not clear, if the methods are inappropriate or wrong, are not up to date, then clearly your proposal will be very weak. And if you don't have a good bibliography in your proposal, if you're making statements without reference to what is the evidence, many people will not consider that as a solid and worthwhile research proposal. So what can I give you as tips for getting grants? First, read the requirements of the granting body and the application form and take it very seriously, because people have spent time developing those, and they mean every section. And they will look at that with great diligence. Make sure that you write the best proposal you can. And there is no shame or harm in asking people for help. And the best people to ask help from is those who have been successful in the past. So reaching out to within your own institutions or people elsewhere, if they have time, is absolutely fine for budding researchers. In my own life experience, 30, 40 years ago, I would have no hesitation. And in those days, there was no email, of writing a letter to people to ask, I'm trying to do this and I don't quite understand this. Could you please guide me? And more often than not, they would not only respond, they would send me references and papers. This is before you had Medline or you had PubMed, and we had to depend upon actually copied papers, etc. And I've already mentioned about how important it is to know what the granting agency's objectives are and how important it is to write clearly. On writing clearly, I want to make a few points because they're very relevant to the applications that we have reviewed. Don't trust the word processor. It will sometimes tell you where the mistakes are. More often than not, sometimes it will make silly mistakes. And therefore, you have to thoroughly check every word, every sentence of your proposal. It is always a good idea to have your proposal reviewed by somebody who's at arm's length. In my department here, we have a principle that for every research proposal that goes out, we have a department review committee, and they have to be people who are not on the proposal, whose job is to provide critical review internally in a friendly manner. And it's much better for you to have that in a friendly manner than to get a review from somebody outside, which is damaging to your proposal after it's been submitted. So before you submit, have it reviewed by your peers and your colleagues in an objective manner, and spend enough time on this. Be absolutely honest. If you don't have the capacity to do certain things and you write that down, I find that more often than not, you're caught out because some of those details don't quite match the CVs and they don't quite match the background or the bibliography. And therefore, it's very important to have that kind of honesty in your proposal grant writing. And I hope that this last point is something that we will all do, and we all do, celebrate when you get your first or your important grant proposal accepted. This is where we all want to end up, and I hope that this will be the case in many instances for people who have been on this, or will be on this series of sessions that have been organized by the HEC. So I'm going to stop at this stage. I think the main value of this session will be in the interaction, and I think we have just a little above an hour. Whatever questions are there, I'll be very happy to answer. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Doctor. So I think we have the floor now session. So I'll request Dr. Uh, he can probably say a few words and then we can hand it over to Umar, who will moderate the question.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen if that's all right.
Yes,
That's fine, Dr.
Okay.
Yeah, so Dr. Gupta, this is Akhtar. Thank you for this very detailed presentation. Uh, I just wanted to maybe start off your Q&A session with a couple of questions, and I wanted to sort of for you to give a little bit of more emphasis on these things. So you've reviewed a number of proposals now in various AGC grants, the ICRG and the Rapid Response Grant for COVID, etc. Uh, uh, you know what? How would you characterize sort of the general nature of the medical proposals that you've seen so far? Uh, I'm sort of thinking in terms of are there enough researchy type of questions, or do you see more of implementation kind of thing? And obviously, the burden of evidence for both of them is also different, perhaps. So, can you sort of um, elaborate a little bit of based on the? I think you've seen, probably hundreds of proposals in the last couple of weeks, couple of
Watch the
months.
100.
So,
Yeah.
can you sort of briefly comment upon what you're seeing and what you're not seeing, what you would like to see more coming from the researchers?
So it's a great question, and I'm going to answer it as honestly as I can. So first thing I must say that compared to 20 years ago, when I was doing this for the HEC for the first time, um, there is a vast improvement in the number and quality of proposals. And I think that's reflective of maybe a new generation of people who are interested in medical allied research. And we have typically, as you know, received a lot more applications in that category than we have for other categories. So definitely there is both improvement in numbers and improvement in quality. But having said that, what are things that are still lacking? So let me reflect on the various proposal cycles. So for cycles where there was the need for a partner in United Kingdom, for example, the ICRG proposals, obviously the grant quality was a lot better because people had written it in collaboration with their UK partners or collaborative universities. But more often than not, they were cut-paste proposals. Somebody had just prepared something for something else, sent it over here, and people just tried to modify it and put it in there. And this was very evident. You could see that immediately in the types of graphics, the types of background that was submitted. So there were perhaps not a lot of thought into what was relevant and important for our country and our environment, our research environment. So, those grants lack that. I think the best measure that we have of indigenous internal capacities around the other calls, of which the Grand Challenges call was there, and so was the COVID call, the Rapid Research COVID call. So those, I will summarize my view on those. Very few applications had done all of the checklists that I've talked about. The background review and the background statements of the problem and capacity and issues, challenges, was generally very weak. People had not referred, I don't recall a single proposal where somebody had actually referred to an up-to-date or current systematic review or meta-analysis in their subject area. And that to me, it reflects on how few people are aware of the importance of systematic reviews. So that was a weakness. Similarly, very few people had referred to objective local data or global burden of disease data relevant to Pakistan as to why they were researching a particular area. or even, local information available. So in many instances, I found that the projects had related to a disorder or a disease, but had not referred to prior or previous work in this space. And I have to be careful. I don't want to mention specific projects or areas because that's not appropriate. But just to say that that was a weak part. Then the hierarchy of weaknesses that were most evident were around the implementation, or let's say the details of how will you do this. So more often than not, that detail was not mentioned in sufficient granularity for us to assess कि ये practical भी है कि नहीं? Will they be able to do it or not? Have they done some prior experiments? So I only recall a few proposals where people had put down, this is what I found from my earlier experiments, and this is what was shown, and this is where I want to go, building on that previous experience. That kind of stuff is very powerful if you're able to put it in, but very few proposals had it. Then the two weak parts that I would point out in proposals, and this is just a hint to those who would apply for other proposals, is I found that the analytical part, the statistical analysis, the sample size determination, the power calculation of the studies, in the few studies that had those, was extremely weak. And many did not even have it. So it was not very clear. Why are you studying 150 people and not 1,500 people or 15,000 people? So that was not clear, because I think maybe they hadn't thought of it, or maybe they did not know how to do it. And there's no shame in not knowing how to do it. As I've mentioned already, in most instances, you can take help from other people. And then, as I mentioned, finally, the organizational part. So in many applications, as I've already discussed with you, Zain and Athar, the team was not fit for purpose, in the sense that you needed assistance from people who were not on your grant proposal. If you needed to have a biostatistician, it was not there. If you needed to have somebody who was an expert in bioinformatics, he was not there. If you needed someone who would represent a particular biology field, that person was not there, or did not have sufficient collaborative linkages within the proposal to it. So that always leaves the question, how are you going to do this? If you get the data and you don't have a person who's capable of analyzing it, how are you going to be able to implement it? So those weaknesses were there in the proposals. And I hope that, as we get more rounds and more proposals coming in for not just HEC grants, but very soon the Health Research Council of Pakistan will be activated, what used to be called the Pakistan Medical Research Council, and there will be possibilities for receiving grants from it. I mean, there are already lots and lots of people who are getting grants from MRC in the UK, from the Wellcome Trust, from the NIH in the USA, from IDRC in Canada, CIHR. I mean, so there are lots and lots of people who are getting grants from these external funding bodies, and they will require all of this that I've talked about.
Umar, do you have any questions on your end? I have a couple of questions that
Yeah, let me, so Dr. Zulfikar, the first question is pointed towards you. Can we have some clarity as regards to case control in historical cohort studies in terms of differences between the two?
Yeah, I mean, case controls are where, going back, you will identify a priori who are your controls and who are your cases. And they are done very selectively. So you decide beforehand that you would have 100 cases and you will identify 200 controls. Okay, and they are generally, designed and done with a very specific power estimation calculation. They're not the strongest of designs, so the world is going away from retrospective looks. A retrospective cohort is where you just go on a fishing expedition without a prior sense of how many subjects will you need to see. So I want to do a retrospective analysis of all the typhoid admissions that I've had at Aga Khan Hospital over the last 20 years. Now I start by looking at all the admissions, and then I may decide that I will look at those who lived and those who died as part of that without a prior sample size estimation. That's not a case control study in its strict sense. That's a retrospective cohort that you've just identified, and you will pick out some of those and hope for the best in terms of getting the right sample size. But for people who are seriously interested in this, there are texts and detailed descriptions of how to design these studies, which I cannot do in this short conversation. So you should be able to read some of the methodological aspects of case control studies and retrospective cohorts, but they're not the best designs in today's world, and you will find that relatively few good journals now publish those kind of stuff. Omar, is there any way I can see the chat, because it might make it a little easier for me to see what the questions are?
Yeah, if you click on the question mark, the Q&A, the live event Q&A, you will see all the questions and comments. While I ask the second question from Dr. Athar, I'll guide you where it is. So Dr. Athar, the second question, I guess, is pointed towards you, and they're asking, unfortunately, the template that we get from HEC doesn't allow for discussing all these headings and aspects of the proposal, thus helping us build our case.
So maybe I think you should address this question, because you've also looked at these proposals.
Right, Dr. Zulfikar?
Well, I think even if the template does not tell you this, generally in the call and in the detailed information around what the call is all about, that information is there. And I don't know which particular call are you referring to, but generally the research bodies will not go through what I've gone through with you. It is just expected that those are things that you will have in your proposal, a specific question, objectives, etc. So research bodies may say this funding is available for research in, again, talking about COVID and looking at COVID and human research outcomes, etc. And we are looking at funding short-term proposals to help improve clinical outcomes. I mean, that's a pretty descriptive detail that you have. Now, within that, how they expect those proposals to come in, it's up to you to develop it. So as I understand and I recall, in the HEC template, you have certain sections which are pretty broad to say, describe your study plan. Within that study plan, you will need to describe it by the areas. What is your hypothesis, your study question? How are you going to do this? What are your inclusion criteria? So a template will generally not give you those details. You're just expected to develop those as part of your application.
Yeah, I agree.
I think the question may also be related to the space available. How much space do you have available? I'll tell you, it is much more difficult to write a concise, precise proposal than to write a 50-page proposal, because then you can go on and on and on. So you have to have that discipline of being able to convey what you want to do in the limited space available. And that's also an art. That's something you have to learn as to how to, be very precise, focused, and concise in your application.
No, so I was just going to add that I think you need to look at your proposal and can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello. Yeah. So I was just saying that I was just going to add to say that you need to look at your proposal in its totality and see and try to understand what parts of your story you are leaving out. Because if you can understand what part of the story you're leaving out, the reviewer will also look at it the same way probably, and if he or she doesn't get the answers that he or she needs to have to evaluate your proposal, he would assume that you sort of don't know the answers, and we can't really go out of the proposal to evaluate a proposal, right? So everything that needs to matter to the selection of your proposal needs to be inside the proposal, and obviously if there are space limits and everything, then it has to be sort of somehow managed in a way that you can do it within the space allocated to you.
So there's a question here. I would like a lot of noise on the call, but it says a lot of money is spent by HEC and agencies on various research grants projects. How many which you think have been beneficial and useful? Are you satisfied with the outcomes? If not, then where are HEC and others falling short? What are your comments on the review process? So I think there are lots of questions in here. And the first thing is we are reviewing a number of those things, and HEC has recently revamped its health science review panels and the review process. And we recognize that the review process is less than perfect. Why? Because the reviewers are all of us, people in the disciplines who come from various universities in Pakistan, because we deliberately decided that for a lot of research projects in Pakistan, we would seek reviewers from within the country and subject areas. And we are doing our level best to improve that process because we know that that process has been less than adequate. Some of the best people out there that we've asked for review have written 2-line reviews, and they may have read the proposal, but they haven't translated that into a detailed comment on the proposal, which is something which is very important for review processes. So I know where this question is coming from, and I empathize with it. We need to significantly improve our review process, which means that we need to train a large number of people, including all of you who are on this call, perhaps as a mixture of grant applicants and others, into how to write a scientifically valid and detailed review, which is helpful. We generally do not encourage unhelpful or let's say contentious reviews. Reviews have got to be helpful to people to be able to write better, to be able to improve their grants, and that's something that comes with experience. So to all researchers today, you will be reviewers tomorrow. To all reviewers who are reviewing grants, you will also be researchers in one capacity or the other. So this interrelationship is very important. So we are initiating, we're in this beginning of this, a training process for reviewers also. We are putting in some defaults in the review process whereby it may not be possible to do a review without providing adequate comments. But we are also initiating, hopefully, there will be some sessions on how to undertake a proper, honest, and helpful review. So that's something that we would like to improve. As to whether research in Pakistan in general, well, it's not just HEC, a lot of the research from the Health Research Council and others in the past has been generally beneficial to the country. I mean, that's a much bigger question. So the first answer to that is there's very little research in Pakistan. If you look at the amount of money we have spent on research within the country in any meaningful way through our academia, our universities, that amount of money has been very, very small. 20 years ago, a lot of money was spent on giving equipment to universities. And that was a very right decision. But at the same time, we had no choice at that time but to send a lot of our people for PhD training outside because there was just no capacity in the country. I think we are now dealing with a situation where we need to increase research capacity in the country with a lot of universities that we have building on what we invested in. But that investment at a university level is too late for many people. If you have a situation in the country where in a large proportion of our colleges and high schools, experimentation or the scientific inquiry has been replaced by what we call ATPs. I don't know how many people know what ATP is. It's not adenosine triphosphate. ATP is now what is called alternative to practicals. And many people, particularly from the well-endowed institutions, schools, colleges, O-levels, A-levels, now do an ATP, which is an alternative to practicals. So they come into universities without having touched a micropipette or having done a simple experiment in a science class. And that, I think, is tragic. When I was growing up, I used to spend a lot of my time in the lab. I mean, as a college student doing salt analysis, I did everything myself. Why? Because it was so important. I was trying to get into a medical college that I thought I would need it. Without all of that has disappeared. And I think we need to certainly use the pulpit of the Higher Education Commission to improve our general undergraduate education. And that process is where the foundations of research and inquiry are set. Umar, any question that you picked up?
Yeah, all right. So the next question, Dr. Zulfikar, is can we combine observational and experimental studies in a research by first looking back and then designing an experimental research?
So it's a very common question asked. Yes, you can, and most people do it, but not in the same grant application. Most people will do the retrospective analysis and formulate a hypothesis and then submit a grant application for the experimental part. But if I receive a grant application where somebody says, I will do 1,000 patients' chart reviews to refine my questions, and then I'm asking you for money to do a trial based on the questions that I will identify, I would not take that seriously because there is just so much uncertainty around this. What if you do the review and you find no research question or your research questions are not solid? Why will I give you money in advance to do something that I have no confidence in your ability to do it? So my advice to you would be to do them separately. If you want to submit a proposal to do a retrospective analysis, do so by all means, and maybe somebody will fund it. But in general, I think you should not combine that together because then it becomes a very iffy kind of a proposal. So there is a question which relates to budget and says you submit the proposal today, grant comes in 2 years later. I hope that will not happen anymore because we are taking decisions on grants very quickly now. But if it does, if there is inflation adjustment needed for the grant application, then by all means get in touch with HEC or any other funding body and make that case. Most people will. And particularly when you're applying for external grants outside of Pakistan, we're applying in foreign currency. And that is automatically adjusted with whatever price inflation there is in local money.
I think if I can add to this reply actually, so we are right now permitting 10% adjustment in the budgets for the equipment actually, especially in related to the inflation to the variations in the foreign exchange.
Yeah. So there is a question or there's a comment by somebody who says that my outline for GCSF has been accepted, but I'm a bit discouraged because I think I should get grants like NRPU or publication record and good GCF written proposal before I get it. So I think the hesitation is valid. As I said, the best scientists and researchers that I know are those who are always very uncertain and not confident that they can do something because you start with a feeling of humility. But you have to start somewhere. So I think even if you think your track record isn't strong, you can improve it. Even if you think your proposal isn't strong, I've just given you many tips as to how you can improve your proposals. So, don't be discouraged. Just spend enough time and write a good proposal. And who knows, you may get it. So there's a question which is very important. Sorry, let me take this. Then I'll leave it here. So it says, can we get an opportunity to connect with reviewers for clarity on few of the comments made? I'm afraid not. The reason is we want to protect the anonymity of our reviewers. And we also want to be very fair because there can be consequences for providing a robust review. And this has been debated and thought about many times. There are some journals now that will provide a named peer review, and there are others that will not have named peer review because people think that if you have a named peer review, you will be less critical in what you put down. So I think at the moment, our principle will be of anonymized peer review. And I think, therefore, if you have issues that you don't understand or you don't agree with, be very clear that you do have those issues on a solid basis, because you don't want to waste HEC's time also. You can get in touch with HEC.
Dr. Buddha, I wanted to ask a question. So in terms of multidisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity, particularly in medical proposals, हम GCF में एक खास किस्म की large problem को tackle करने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं, which part of it might be medical research issue, but part of it could be also social issue.
Okay, I think I've got the question, Athar. You're breaking up. So this is on multidisciplinarity of research, particularly around health sciences. How can we make this happen?
Yes, and what kind of collaboration should people look for in the medical research?
So this is an extremely important question, and it's something which is very close to my own heart, because I lead now an institute for global health and development where the focus is on multidisciplinary research. So we should encourage this by the nature of many of the calls that we have. So I think within the Grand Challenges arena and others, HEC should actively encourage multidisciplinary research. Now, what kind of disciplines can come together with allied medical and allied health disciplines? So there are some disciplines which are absolutely critical to doing good research today. One of those is social sciences, anthropology. In Pakistan, you can do absolutely nothing in many health interventions without understanding the social determinants of health and without understanding some of the community engagement aspects. In a lot of my own work now, I spend a lot more time on the qualitative side of research than on the quantitative side alone. It's very important for success. Secondly, health economics. So you have to have a very solid linkage of your proposal with health economics. You have to have translation, which also relies upon other additional disciplines. So there are lots of disciplines, including, as I said, anthropology, gender, health economics, and social behavioral research, which are very important to undertaking biomedical research of the kind. They may not be necessarily relevant to some experimental research that you do in a laboratory, but in human subjects research, especially at population level, it's increasingly very difficult to do research without understanding that. I wish that in our COVID call for research, that we had received applications that would have related to the difficulties that we eventually encountered in COVID work in Pakistan around community engagement, community buy-in, communication strategies, and on understanding some of those dynamics of the demand creation around even things like PPE. So I think it's our job as research funders to ensure that increasingly all the research that is done within health and health related disciplines aligns with the health and health related sustainable development goals. If you look at the SDGs, there are 17 SDGs, of which health is just one, goal 3. But there are 9 or 10 SDGs that are directly related to goal 3, whether they are nutrition, whether they are gender, whether they are environment, whether they are living conditions, whether they are adolescent health. I mean, so water, sanitation, hygiene, they are totally linked to health. And I would very strongly encourage applications that look at the interface or the connectivity of those. Water, sanitation, hygiene in Pakistan remains a massive issue. And I've seen proposals that are focused on the biomedical part of that, but not necessarily on the social behavioral part. So we need to make that linkage.
So, Dr. Gupta, one of the things that we said yesterday when we started this series was that in the current form, the PO stage proposals that we've received, I think the vast majority of them do not qualify, in my mind, as DCF style interventions. They are too narrowly focused on just the piece. So in the case of medical, for example, they may solve a specific medical problem to some experimental design or something. But when you're looking at how do they go and impact society, that piece is often missing in most proposals. Is that something you would agree upon, and how do you suggest? So apart from social scientists and health economics, how do you suggest that proposals can be strengthened on their societal impact part?
So I think if I understood your question, I mean, that's a very important area for us to nurture from this platform. So for these research projects, increasingly looking at within calls for descriptions and challenges that will require multidisciplinary work. So I think this is something that we as a panel, when we do our health research prioritization exercise, we need to put in defaults. That's for some grants, you have to have a multidisciplinary team because you cannot do it from just one discipline. That's one way of doing it. The other is to develop a process of encouragement within our universities. So I think the sessions for education have to be done also in partnership with the universities, where we encourage universities to create those multidisciplinary research platforms, where people from different allied disciplines, whether they are social sciences or pure medical allied and other disciplines, can sit together and work together. Multidisciplinary research does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs and it's based on these collaborations and linkages that are established, and they can be nurtured over time. So my suggestion would be to do it in both ways, through a pull and push mechanism. So the pull mechanism would be the HEC creating those platforms for submitting proposals for multidisciplinary topics, but the push would be to work with universities and our research institutions to encourage the creation of those multidisciplinary platforms, because without that, I don't think they can achieve their objectives. There are lots of questions in the chat around the review process. Let me just say to you that as chair of the panel, I am acutely aware of the limitations of the review process, both qualitatively and quantitatively. And that's something that we will fix. And I am already working with our worthy leaders at HEC to make sure that we do it in a manner that's sustainable. And that's also something that we don't, just leave to happenstance, that we actively invest in this. So watch the space. But I will say to you that those, and I don't know what level, those of you who are on the research side asking those questions, place yourself in the shoes of being reviewers yourself. So just remember, we are encountering this today because we have no training, we have no history, we have no track record of people doing robust reviews. So all of those things that you're saying around harsh reviews, perfunctory reviews, reviews that have misunderstood things, I mean, are things that only occur if people don't do them again and again and again. So I think we need a massive training process for reviewers. And I think that review process training is linked to research training. So it's totally, you can't do a review if you are not a good researcher yourself. And therefore those two things are interlinked. But we will address this and we will get better at this over time. And it's a process that does not happen overnight. I can tell you that I'm pleasantly surprised that we have people willing to do reviews. 20 years ago, I remember one project where it took me 3 months to even get somebody to agree to do a review. There were very few people who were willing to do reviews. So there is improvement, and I hope we will get younger and perhaps more mid-level careers in the review process. So Qausar Abdullah has a question. So this is around execution and any comments on what happens in purchase of equipment and consumables if it has to go through pepper, I lose nothing. I'm doing time. So, Kausar, I am very sympathetic to this. I think we need to work, and we need to work through the good offices of the chair of the HEC to make sure that we can get some of these things streamlined and fast-tracked. We know how it has happened for COVID. For COVID-related work, a lot of these things were fast-tracked through PEPRA and other equipment procurement through other processes. So I would like personally, if I have any opportunity, to see how on the research side, the Higher Education Commission could have an agreement with the relevant bodies in Pakistan to ensure that not only can equipment be procured fast, but can be procured at the best possible rates. And I agree with you that if it cannot be done within the the time span of a project, then we need to review the time span. Other questions?
So there's a comment. HEC need to look at the procedure for the purchase of equipment, which you've already responded through the suppliers. We always waste the time, and ultimately in 3 years, project 2 years usually pass without the equipment. Definitely research output affected with the current way of purchase. So this one you've already responded, Dr. Zulfikar. There is no need to further elaborate. Most of the comments are regarding the review process and the budget and the timelines, and I think most of these have been answered. We will have the Q&A uploaded on the GCF website under the FAQs, and the recorded session will also be made available there for those who could not attend. I think we have covered most of the points. Dr. Athar and Dr. Zulfikar, any concluding comments that you may want to have for the audience before we close out the session today?
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing is for us to recognize that we are starting a journey in which we are trying hard now to improve the science funding and the review process at HEC. It is something that doesn't happen overnight. I will say again that, from the perspective of where I'm sitting, I mean, I do reviews all the time for MRC, for NIH and CIHR here, the major science funding bodies in the West. And we do them because it's the same process as that of grant application. So the pool is the same. It's the same people who would be grant applicants one day, who are reviewers on the other. So people are very cognizant of the fact that they have to be thorough, rigorous, kind, and they have to be because what you do unto others may happen to you tomorrow. So we are embarking on this process of reviewer education, and I think it's linked to research training also. So I'm grateful to the HEC for creating this platform where we are discussing this openly. And I've said to you that the review process was suboptimal, and we will improve that. But how will we improve it? By engaging many of you people as reviewers. I mean, I assume that many of the people on the call are people who are researchers and faculty themselves who've been part of the application process. So don't do unto others what you wouldn't want to be done to you. So therefore, a review process has to become very objective, very scientifically valid. And when we put those things in place, hopefully very soon, inshallah, then help us do that, because we will be putting out a call for reviewers. We will invite people to be part of the reviewer pool because the pool is very limited. There was a comment here to say most scientists know each other and there's a small review pool. I want to expand that pool. I'd like to have a pool of 1,000 reviewers in Pakistan outside of our traditional, limited reviewers. And those have to be people who are doing this with full transparency. Whether this is open science and all reviews will become open science, I'm not aware of a scientific grant review process yet from any of the large agencies which is open. A journal review process, article review process, yes, but science reviews processes, because it involves money, generally are considered anonymous, and there are a number of conflicts of interest in there that funding bodies have to take into account, such as institutions, such as areas, such as competition. we would be absolutely requiring, if I get my way, that for all reviewers and researchers to be submitting conflict of interest statements, because we need to have those right up front in terms of assessing whether or not there is something that we need to be aware of a priori. This recent example of withdrawal of papers and the biggest universities, I mean, the Harvard it was one of the culprits in this. Also suggests that these processes are not foolproof. So we will be putting those in place. Help us do this, and inshallah, we'll all come out better. Thank
so,
you.
Dr. Athar, just last question, maybe in your concluding comments, you can respond to that, or Dr. Zan, either. Care about capacity building initiatives quite late. Is it possible to do that in advance? People have been getting notifications about this series just a day before the start on 1st July, many including missed yesterday's session. Also for the calls, is it possible to have the entire calendar of upcoming grants made available so that we can start planning our consortium and teaming strategies in advance?
So I think some of them are kind of HEC questions that I think Zain can answer. I think the calendar is already up there somewhere, I think. And with regards to this series, again, if you've missed the first one or this one, these would be available online. It's probably best to attend them live because then you can also ask questions and interact. But they would be made available online, so you can refer to them, later on. We do understand that this is a bit late in the process, but still, there is at least a month, 5 weeks to a month before your GCF proposal is due, and this was partly also driven by the kind of proposals that we received. We thought there were weaknesses in certain areas that needed to be addressed. As I said yesterday, if we don't get the kind of proposals in August that can lead to an impact, we won't fund them. We won't fund something that is not leading to a GCF style impact. So, we can fund fewer proposals this year if we are going to get fewer proposals of good enough quality. But, this is an attempt to try to improve the quality of the proposals that we receive. Also, I think, I'm going to say to sort of, second Dr. Bhutta's point, the quality of review is also, sort of reciprocally related to the quality of proposals that we get in. I know we extended the deadline for GCF by a week, and the number of proposals increased by at least 25-30%. Now, the proposals that were initiated and concluded in the last week are probably not the proposals that were of very high quality. They were probably proposals that were recycled from somewhere else and put into a GCF call. And we saw some of those proposals. I mean, we had to sort of, literally in the first screening shortlist about 200 or 300 proposals and, delete them so as to not inundate the reviewers. I mean, with a limited amount of reviewers and a limited amount of time, if you're going to sort of, overload them with a lot of, junk, you're going to get junk out of the system. So I think there is a shared responsibility on the part of the submitters as well as the reviewers to make sure that the time is spent in the most productive and wise way so that you can get the right kind of feedback that you deserve to improve your proposals. With the first call of GCF, we simply just had too many proposals, I think, to be able to provide that kind of feedback. Which is also, one of the reasons we are doing this, general series, because I don't think we have provided enough constructive feedback on every single approved proposal that we should have.
And just to add to that, we have already uploaded the recording for the first session on the GCF website, and this session's recording will also be made available at the same link on GCF website today. all questions, any additional questions that you may have that remain unanswered in today's session, please email info-rnd@agc.gov.pk. That email has been shared with you in your emails. We will try to respond to all your questions. The questions that were asked today and for whom we had response from Dr. Zulfikar Bhutta and Dr. Athar, we will include that in the FAQs. There will be a series of workshops in the next coming week, 2 weeks, and you will have ample opportunity to interact with other experts and ask your questions. Apologies for any delays that we may have in announcing and updating you about this workshop series, but you know, rest assured you'll have ample opportunity to ask all your questions and get clarifications. On that note, I thank our presenters, Dr. Zulfikar Bhutta and Dr. Athar, and I'll let Dr. Zain, share his concluding comments before we end the session.
Thank you, Umar. So again, I'd like to thank Dr. Zulfikar and Dr. Athar for arranging these workshops and also for giving their very scientific input and also commenting on the review processes that we are right now undergoing a revamping of exercise actually. I would also like to inform you that we have actually shared a calendar with you for the people who have attended some of these road shows that were conducted last December, actually November and December last year. GCF is one of the grants that was already in the process. Actually, we have a couple of more grants that we are going to announce in the coming few weeks, and also we are going to conduct similar kind of exercise and workshops actually in order to introduce those grants as well actually to you as well. Okay. So please stay tuned for most of these new initiatives that we are launching actually, and we will be able to share more information about these later on with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.